Hello, everyone, and good evening, good morning. Welcome to yet another edition of Home and the World, where we are really at home discussing things right from history to geopolitics and, even our inner worlds. So, continuing our conversation on the American, on the USNB. Um, we left off the last episode with the empire with a difference. So maybe you can elaborate a bit about that, Dr. Paransky.
Yes. Thank you, Gayatri. In fact, viewers, the thing I wanted to emphasize once again is that this show is about, examining issues in a somewhat deeper way, not just polemics, not politics, not propaganda, certainly. And we always like to base ourselves on something that has already been published, to which the viewers can go back. So this is based on an essay I wrote in Open Magazine, and it was called Merit is Destiny, right? And I talked about a strange phenomenon in that essay. First of all, I spoke about India's democratic as opposed to demographic dividend, in which I argued that the dividends of democracy can actually become penalties if you don't allow for the best ideas to jostle, and if you constantly try to control things or centralize things. Because democracies are about conversations and arguments, right? So they're not about control, trying to control everything. And this actually takes us straight back to the US, because it's not a society where you can actually control anything or anybody. People are free in a way that's unimaginable anywhere else in the world. We'll talk about that as well, because that freedom can be very dangerous, including the freedom to own guns. Anyhow, but the point I was making in that article also is India's China envy, in both the good and bad sense of the word, where the masters, as it were, want to emulate China, one party, one leader, one election, etc., and control everything, which is not good for us. And the people have a different kind of China envy because they see efficiency, cleanliness, you know, lack of corruption at the lower levels, and tremendous progress, etc. So, but we have a US gripe, not so much US envy, because I mean, Indians want to go to the US. There's a line outside the US embassy, people are waiting in queue, and it's not just the embassy. Through the student route, through any possible means, Indians want to get to the US. In fact, during the Biden floodgates, there were many illegal Indians going into the US. We were the second or third largest number of illegals, which we don't like to talk about. So we hate the US on the one hand, but we all want to go there. And in certain states like Punjab, everyone wants to go there through every possible means, or even Gujarat, through the relatives, first preference, second preference. So how is it that we all want to go there, but we have so much of resentment against the US? And it's not just India, but a lot of people resent the US, partly because they're so amazingly successful. So I said last time in the last episode that the US is an empire with a difference. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is most empires are based on territorial expansion. Okay, they conquer other people, sometimes they enslave them, or they just invade them. There are invader colonies, there are settler colonies. Like Britain, invaded many parts of the world and they settled these parts, some of them like, you know, the New Zealand or Australia, Canada, parts of South Africa. These were kind of settler colonies where, Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, it used to be called Rhodesia, it was divided. Rhodesia became Zimbabwe, Zambia. So British people or people from the British Isles went and settled in these places and in far-flung places, right? Like Falklands. And there's a bunch of British, I would say Irish people, even in Argentina, even today, even in their football team. So settler colonies, invader colonies, territorial expansion. We saw China expanding. Now, it is not that the US didn't do that, but they did it mostly in their own North America. In other words, they fought a war with the British in which the French helped them, you know, and the French and the British fought wars in the subcontinent, but as well as North America. But these wars in the far flung regions of empire were actually based on a conflict on the continent in Europe itself. And the treaties in Europe resulted in the French basically giving up their territories to the British in India and to an extent in the US. Large swathes of territory from Quebec down to Louisiana were owned by the French, and the US purchased these territories. Quebec in Canada is still French speaking, and they used to threaten to secede. So let's understand this complex history and what the United States did in continental America. They started with 13 colonies, which had a very small swathe of land on the eastern border, eastern seaboard, I would say, the Atlantic coast. And then they expanded all the way, to California. And they did it in many different ways. They bought land, like the Louisiana Purchase. They conquered land. They also, in a way, cheated. They drove back the Indians. They had treaties with the Indians. They gobbled up Indian lands. By Indians, I mean Native Americans. They pushed them into reservations. They conquered territory from Mexico. So the Mexican invasion of the U.S. is the revenge of history, in a manner of speaking. Florida, for example, uh, belonged to the English during the American War of Independence, and it was a British territory which they gave to the Spanish. So what I'm trying to say is the U.S. War of Independence was also a European war with European ramifications, and the revolutionaries, the Americans, were supported by the French and the Spanish, who didn't like the British. So it's a very complicated situation. In Alaska, they bought from Russia. Likewise, they've got Hawaii, they've got other islands here and there, but they had a big opportunity to become a traditional empire. How? Because they defeated the Spanish and they basically got control of the Philippines. And they ruled the Philippines for a while. That's why the Philippines are still so, Americanized. But they decided they didn't want to go in the territorial way. So they became a different kind of empire. This is the point I'm trying to make. Whereas Europe had this territorial expansion. So you had a small country like Belgium, but because they had the Industrial Revolution backing them, they conquered Congo. So there was Belgian Congo in Africa, many times the size of Belgium. And it was such a brutal regime under a king called Leopold, where they stole ivory from Congo, from the Africans, and they cut off their hands. It's a horrible story. It's a story of horror, which is many times more horrible than anything you can imagine that the Americans did. Guantanamo Bay and all of this, the napalm bombing of Vietnam, terrible as they were, pale in comparison to what the Europeans did all over the world. The Germans were late empire builders. They conquered the Horn of Africa, Eritrea, places like that. So these empires were based on very simple ideas of extraction, expropriation, loot, basically. The British excelled at it. But the Americans came up with a new system. And in fact, they were themselves anti imperialists. Let's not forget that they fought against the British, right? And they became the first democracy in the world, the first, Republican democracy in the world 200 years ago. And it's an amazing fact that they've survived. No state has survived so long without a revolution, without a major change. Of course, they had a terrible civil war, but the American system has survived. So, what I'm trying to say is the Americans are not imperialistic by impulse. They're actually anti-imperialistic. And so when Britain didn't want to give up India, Roosevelt actually made it a condition of his support to Churchill that you'll have to give up the Indian Empire. So we don't know this. And as I said, we haven't studied America's role in our history properly. So America is essentially anti-imperialist, okay? But the power, the baton, as it were, passed on to the US I mean, partly by, expediency, because, America interfered in both the world wars. It was not their world war, right? They were quite safe. They were in a different part of the world. It's very hard to invade America. You see, there's a big Atlantic Ocean on one side, there's a big Pacific Ocean on the other side. The borders are not hostile. Canadians are not hostile to America, and nor is Mexico, right? So they got involved in these wars for a variety of reasons. But the Second World War, there was a bargain where basically the British agreed to hand over the reins of empire to America. And America agreed. And when the British were reluctant, they seized power. How did they do it? Through financialization. Britain had the reserve currency, the pound, and America then took over. The dollar is today the reserve currency of the world. So America's imperialism is through remote control. It's not through conquest of territory alone. And it's not only underwritten by the force of arms. It is the force of arms, because without arms, you can't control anybody. It is a policeman of the world. And Americans have died in many theaters of war very far away from home. And in recent times, Iraq, Afghanistan, prior to that, Vietnam, more than 100,000, well, I can't remember exactly how many, but a lot of Americans died in Vietnam, maybe 60,000, 70,000, possibly more than the numbers that died in the First World War, right? And even today, more Americans died in the Civil War than in, either World War. So we don't understand what was actually happening, with the US. So the US is a hegemon. It's a kind of, what would you say, guarantor of the rule of law in an international order. Okay, it is the superpower that ensures an international rule-based order. And the reason people are very resentful of US now is because it's throwing its hands up and saying, no, you pay for it. You want it, you pay for it. And that's why the resentment in Germany or maybe in Europe, where American soldiers were guarding these countries and these people were not paying for their own defense. But the point I was trying to make is America is an empire with a difference because it is not interested in invading or settling distant parts of the world to extract money from them. Instead, it is an empire which is based not only on the force of arms, but on finance. Okay, it's a different kind of empire. It exercises control through finance, okay, through the dollar, through the stock market, through the big American companies that rule the world. If you look at the list of the Fortune 500 companies, I mean, almost 80%, I don't have the latest statistic, but America has an overwhelming share of these companies. And these American mega, whatever these magnificent seven or these big companies are everywhere in the world. So they're not just US companies, okay? The other way it controls the world or it exercises dominance is through technology. So in the last episode, I said I was at the beginning of the PC revolution, and now here we see the AI revolution. America's advantage is based on that. It dominates through technology, through innovation, right? So that is why those who hate America actually are the people who want to take the world backwards. They're counter-systemic, right? Either they're people of the book or they just want to destroy things. They're not people who want to innovate. They don't want to say, oh, we'll innovate more, right? Instead, they're saying, stop the innovation, dead to the Satan. So just to finish what I'm trying to say, that I don't think about a situation immediately, going back to Sri Aurobindo. We have to evolve as humanity, to have world governance, to go beyond the nation state. The nation state is a magnification of our own ego, the tribal ego. So I love India, but I don't have a very narrow, chauvinistic, imagination. I think the world is actually Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, means that the human species is one. So until we come to that realization, until we have world government, freedom of movement, justice and equality, we will still have the state system. States will compete, but the forces, I would think, of light as opposed to the forces of darkness. The forces of light are those who want expansion, who want prosperity, who want a freedom, who want a rule-based world order, who want norms, who want arrangements which are not arbitrary, which are based on reciprocity, mutual interest, contractual obligations, as opposed to those who want to control, who want to dominate, whether it's dominating women, whether they are fanatics, they believe their way or the highway or their way or the hell, you know. So, so I think the fight is between, I would call it death cults, people who worship death, and people who love life. So I'm putting it in an abstract way, but I don't see a world in which dominance is going to evaporate overnight. Humanity has to evolve gradually to be able to, as it were, come to that state. And from that point of view, people like Sri Aurobindo, like Mahatma Gandhi, were way ahead of their times because they felt the human race could transform. But we are so selfish. We exploit each other even within our society. Look around you, right? Even within India, we are a very unequal society. So who are we to preach equality to other people, right? So I'm only trying to say that we have to take an integral approach to the whole thing. And the lesser of the two evils, to my mind, in Cold War 2.0, is a world where maybe the US is the number one power and the democratic countries, have this alliance and can trade with one another, contribute to each other's prosperity, as opposed to the other side, which is based on authoritarian or totalitarian systems of control, dominance, and ultimately, I would call it the anti-liberty forces.
Yes. In fact, I was going to ask you to summarize where does it leave us between China envy and US gripe, and you concluded it very beautifully. That
See, I want to say something, Gayatriji. We are very proud of being non-aligned, but we need to understand what it means. Now, the present regime very proudly broke from the Nehruvian past, and instead of calling ourselves non-aligned, we have, you know, some other word for it. We call ourselves, a balancing power, a swing state, or we call it multipolarity. We have different words, but instead of, strategic, we call it not strategic autonomy. See, non alignment has just been given a new spin, strategic autonomy, right? And I'm not saying India should be in any camp. We are too big to be in any camp. But we can't be constantly playing this. Like, it's like saying that, yeah, तुम मुझसे गुस्सा करोगे तो मैं उससे दोस्ती कर लूंगा. Come on, what kind of attitude is this? Like there are two big bullies, let's say, and you say, okay, you're not nice to me, I'll go and be pally to them. No, have some principles, boss. Be principled. At least one of the two bullies has invaded you. Has the other bully invaded you? No. They don't have a territorial dispute with you. 5 million of your people are there. It's like a diaspora. They can't go against you. Please think a little bit. And this gunda is in your neighborhood. Sorry to use this unparliamentary language. Wouldn't you be safer being the friend of a distant gunda than one in your neighborhood who can come to your doorstep and try and grab things from you? So we have to be, much, sanctimonious as we are about being the Vishwa Guru. Let's be a bit practical. Of course, we trade with China. Our biggest imports are from China, but we have a surplus with Russia, with USA, and we have a deficit with China. It's as simple as that. And speaking about Russia, somehow the word came out. Yeah, we were good friends, but nobody can deny that Russia is not a rising power. It's a declining power. So maybe we should leave it at that and go into something else maybe next time, or come back to this topic of our prospects in the neighborhood and the world another time maybe. But if you have any concluding thoughts, you can tell me what you think.
No, and I believe we have very. I mean, we have no dearth of talent, whether in the current, whether it's our bureaucrats, our foreign services, and administrative service personnel, and you know we hope that there will be, apart from the patriotic and the sentimental emotions that we feel towards our country, which is not bad or wrong, but I hope we also see what is the reality, nature of reality that we're dealing with right now. What are the kind of beats
Exactly. See, I want to end on this note.
your words?
I want India to take a leaf from the American playbook. I want India to be the land of the free and the home of the brave too. You said we have so much talent, but we are so afraid of talent. We have a talent deficit and a talent phobia. Just look around you in class,
I
everywhere.
don't think the
Everybody
deficit.
is
I
smart. They want to bring you down. They just want to push
yes,
you down.
yes,
If you're a little smart,
it's not a
and this
deficit,
is
but
even in
it's
families, everyone wants to push down the talented person rather than recognizing and incentivizing talent. And we've gone too far in this whole thing about, our whole, oh, uplift the downtrodden, uplift. Of course, uplift the downtrodden, but please protect your talented because they all want to leave your country, right? I mean, today, there's a big propaganda going on that US is falling apart, Indians come back. But hey, do you have jobs for them? Do you have a clean city for them where they can live? Do you have urban infrastructure? Do you have garbage collection? Do you have a wonderful city where a person would say, I love this place? No. You've got a broken system. You can't clean up the air. Your waters are filthy. And you have really no capacity at the present to absorb talent because the entire system has been cornered. If you look at the private sector, you have these crony capitalists. It's not an open system. Tomorrow you want to start a company, please, let's be a bit honest. So the private sector is cornered by these, few people, and the public sector, you know how it is,
yeah.
you know. So let's maybe reflect on that, pause on that, and
And
let's not just jump on a bandwagon and say, "Arey, we are the greatest, we are the oldest civilization." Of course, you are.
everything is there, but then we can't just be stuck there without looking at the present of current challenges and how to deal with them with whatever we have, whatever the gifts we have of our civilization, about with our forefathers, with everything, with our culture, with our scriptures, everything put together. How are we using that in the current context and challenges? So, with that, thank you so much, Dr. Paranspe, with a very passionate episode this was. And viewers, please do like, share, and subscribe to our channel. And let us know if you liked it or didn't like it with your comments, questions. And we will see you next time with a new topic, a new article, or a new thought to delve on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Namaste.